Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to Power BI Governance, the key to driving adoption. So thank you so much for everybody for choosing to spend your 20 minutes after lunch with me. First of all, I'll say hello. So my name is Megan Lividas. I'm going to try to not be overly Scottish today. If I get to the point where I need subtitles, my husband's going to wave at me and I'll try and slow down a bit, okay? So I am head of BI and analytics at Dufresne. We are a data consultancy that do everything from architecture, engineering, to all the fun analytics that come at the end. I work across multiple industries and sectors, but you'll typically find me in insurance and retail, particularly fond of those sorts of clients. Now, I'm on a mission to help organisations recover some control over Power BI environments that have become a beast of their own. And so my key thing that you're going to find me talking about is how do I create a Power BI culture? How do I actually get a return on investment from my reporting once I've launched all those great reports? How do I get people using them? Now, let's start with, well, why do we bother? Why are we here? Do we not just build the reports? We publish them, job done, right? And I've switched my tenant on, I've assigned my licenses. What more is there to worry about? Now, typically where I tend to enter a client is about 1 year down the line. And where we find ourselves is there is thousands of workspaces, and I'm not exaggerating. The current client I'm at, they do have literally quite thousands of workspaces. There is no version of the truth. So two directors will turn up to the same meeting. Sales are down. What are you talking about? Sales are up. They are both talking about the same thing, but they've got it from completely different places because there is no version of the truth anymore. Because we are swimming in duplicates of the same content. This is what happens when you give everybody in the organization a license and encourage them to get developing. And at some point, users probably gave up. They're in Excel, probably the finance lot, and that's okay. You know, we don't mind Excel. But when they're using it as their source, well, this is where we get problems. Now, at some point, a developer somewhere is going to be asked to fix a bug, and they're going to go into the back of something they've not looked at in 12 months and go, how many Power Query steps are there? God forbid any of them are replacing values, which I have seen. I did a bit of work for a confectioner where I found them with about 50 replace value steps to just correct every bit of bad data they had. So that was fun to unpick. And at this point, your BI team are probably pretty overwhelmed. Now, it's not a great picture, but the good answer is we don't need to give up, right? We don't just call it a day from there. This is where, to be honest, it's a sweet spot to be in. Obviously, it's nice to get it right from the start, but when you're at the point where you've got this much going on in your environment, at least you know what you need. This is a nice place to work back from. The key before you start getting lost in workspaces and tenant settings is to take a step back and have a think about what's your goal, what do you want to achieve, and that comes down to defining the Power BI culture that you want to create. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between controls and innovation. How do we get that balance right between putting controls in place, but still allowing an environment where innovation can thrive through engaged, happy users and self-service? Now, I find most organizations tend to start somewhere around the bottom here. So the free-for-all environment that we're all familiar with. Everyone's developing, there is a high risk of duplication, and that's because people are self-serving their own data, and by self-serving, I mean they're all building their own thing, and they're probably happy about it, it's fine. But at some point, IT, data, we tend to get wind and we go, well, we're not too happy about it, so let's put some governance in place. Unfortunately, this is where the balance tends to slip. People usually find themselves now losing that engagement, and they find themselves, they've maybe managed to set up the self-service, and they've got the governance controls in place, but people aren't using the service, and that typically comes down to two things. One, is it a training issue? So is it that you've put so many controls in place that are not accessible to users? You've maybe not spent enough time with those users to help them understand how to engage with the platform? Or have you just absolutely stifled all control? You know, if I'm a citizen developer in the business, let's say I work in finance, if I've got an inaccessible process to get a new workspace, to get access to my data that already exists, why should I bother? I'll just do it myself. I'll just go straight to my source system and I'll stay in Excel, thank you very much. Now, there is, of course, businesses that don't have self-service and they have this balance of governance and engagement. And this can work perfectly well. Not all organizations need self-service. If you're happy to have a data team that produces reports, this can work fine. But the key to making this work is a superstar BI team, of course, and very proactive business partners. If you want to operate in a world where you don't have self-service, but you are happy users and you're governed, this is where you need to be out and guessing what your users need before they're asking for it. Now, what we're going to talk about today is this sweet spot right in the middle. A world in which you have self-service capability, your users are happy about it, but there is governance surrounding it. And this is the key to really driving a Power BI culture from my experience. Now, let's just examine that relationship between self-service a little bit more. Now, this is from Naz Razdev of Infinite Lambda. This was going around LinkedIn, I think last year, and I just thought it summed it up perfectly. The need for self-service really comes down to the bottleneck that is created when you limit who can request MI and you restrict who actually has access to share that data. Look at all this data that's sat in your organization right now, and how much are you bottlenecking that flowing through to insight by having a central data team that don't share that insight with anyone. The key to widening the neck of the data governance hourglass is a self-service capability. If I'm in finance and I want to be able to quickly understand what's going on, I should not have to wait on someone in BI getting me that number if I've got the capability and the desire to get it myself. So as I'm talking about self-service, I feel like there's probably a lot of different things in people's minds. We're talking about Power BI, we're talking about Fabric self-service. There are a lot of ways that we can do that. So I'm going to introduce you to my self-service pyramid. So I cooked this up with my colleague Glenn Piper up in Edinburgh. I could honestly talk to you for probably a whole 50 minutes just about this pyramid. So I'm just going to do a bit of an overview today. The key to this is understanding how far you want to go with a self-service capability. The further into the pyramid we go, the more freedom you give your business users, but the more control you're relinquishing as a data team. My advice, you start at the top. Now, to be honest, what typically happens is people start at the middle. You know, everyone's building new data set per report, and that's just what happens. But we're going to step back and let's talk about personalizing reports. So your data team have published a report, it's got a great visual, that's what we want them to use. If I'm in finance, can I not personalize that bar chart and turn it into a table in the version that I look at? And now you've got one report that is being used by the business, but people are customizing visuals for what they need to see, stopping them having to export out to Excel or have a second report. Now, analyzing Excel. I feel like a lot of us that work in Power BI go on a journey of Excel being the enemy. And I'm kind of at the later stages of that where Excel is unavoidable. You're never going to get Excel out of the hands of finance users. My husband is a finance man himself, so I've learned the hard way. They're just not going to happen. The key to this is to not prize Excel away from them, but to help them connect Excel to Power BI. So just as straightforward as spending time with finance and showing them how you can connect from Excel to a Power BI data set, they're now doing their pivot tables, they're doing what they need, but they can refresh those pivot tables on the fly, connecting to your self-service data set, and that's how you retain that governance. They're not having to export, you don't know what version they've got anymore, they're connected to exactly where you need it to be. Now the sweet spot is the concept of having centralized data sets with new reports that run off of those data sets. And this is really, I find, for most of the organizations I tend to work in, what we are working towards. Now, I'm not going to touch too much on the kind of lower end of the pyramid here, but if you are a slightly smaller organization, naturally data flows can be a fantastic way to make things like date tables more accessible. I think in my experience, where I see this start to go a bit rogue is where organizations have massive data platforms and then they're putting a lot of data flows on top of those platforms and expecting those data flows to do all the heavy lifting that maybe isn't happening in the platform. At the point at which you have things like this happening, I think this is where you're beginning to introduce too many points in your lineage. So for me, it's all about scaling it back and having clean data platforms with centralized data sets running off of them. Now, business-owned data sets, this is a concept that my colleague Glenn champions quite a bit. And this is very much where you have an organization where you maybe don't have a central data team. You have developers in HR, developers in finance. And the way that you can retain some level of governance in that environment is you have the business own their data. So HR owns their salary data, finance owns their cost data. And when finance want to self-serve from HR, they can do that through the HR team. And this is a model that can absolutely work in a smaller sort of enterprise. But we are mostly going to be focusing on this middle tier of the pyramid here. So we're now on the same page when it comes to self-service. How do we actually put some governance around it? Now, a quote from a client that I've spoke to, Microsoft will give you 1,000 ways to do something. They will not tell you the one right way to do it. And I hate to break it to you, there is not one right way. I could stand here today and I could tell you, that's the way I want you to do self-service, and this is how you're going to set up your workspaces, and there's probably loads of blogs that will tell you the absolute opposite. For every one way there is to do something in Power BI, that's probably the right thing for one organization or another. The key thing that you can do for your business, so whether you're in the data function or you're a leader in this space, is to have a think about the typical consultant mindset, right? People, process, and technology. And what I'm going to present to you is what parts of Power BI slot into this framework and how you can then use that to your advantage. And what I'm going to have by the end of this slide is your shopping list. So I'm going to talk about the elements of people, process, and technology in Power BI governance and culture. And by the end of it, have a think about what bits of this you're missing. So if you own the Power BI tenant in your organization, or you're just starting out, or maybe you're a part of it somewhere, have a think about what bits of these can essentially form your Power BI culture roadmap. So inevitably, when I talk Power BI governance, everyone thinks about the workspaces and the tenant settings first, and that's absolutely important. But to me, none of those things happen before you've addressed how you want Power BI to work with your people. To me, there are three key components of this. Defined roles. So I've entered organizations where it seems like the basics, but really you haven't defined roles. People get Power BI licenses, and that's about as far as it goes. You need to ask yourself, who are your BI admins? Now, if you're a small organization, your CFO might be your main developer, your analyst, and your Power BI admin, and that's fine. But the minute you become a slightly larger organization and you don't have this role defined, there is no clear ownership or accountability of who needs to monitor those tenant settings, which can change on a monthly basis, and that's fantastic. We love new features, but who's staying on top of that and making sure that the right thing for your organization is in place? Training. I think Power BI, the best thing about Power BI is that a lot of us are self-taught. I personally am someone who was an admin in a sales team back in about 2017, and someone chucked me a license and said, right, you enjoy. And here I am, 6 years later, I'd say an expert at Power BI. But that all came from YouTube, watching all these talks that happen at SQLBits, very much getting into a client and figuring it out for myself. But I've augmented that with the sort of formal learning that you get from Microsoft. And I think this is a key thing that most organizations need to make sure they're on top of. What learning paths do you have in place for your team? Microsoft have got some amazing free content, so just putting people on the PL300 certification pathway and encouraging them to work along can really catch those bad habits that people might have picked up as they're developing on their own, and encourage you as an organisation to be rolling out best practice development. And last but not least in this section is community engagement. Now, I've seen a few talks just this week about community engagement in itself. Creating a Power BI Centre of Excellence is so critical to making sure that you don't have pockets of insight and silo and ways of working. I'm at a global business right now, and they've got so many Power BI teams across the business at very different scales of maturity. There is no point in each of those teams reinventing the wheel with their practices every time they kind of embark on a new project. And having a centre of excellence where people can combine that knowledge, we do things like knowledge forums. So every single time you find a sticky point and it took you a whole day to fix that, go and write up a slide with what the issue was and how you fixed it, and you put that in a central knowledge forum for people to search. So we've got this fantastic forum internally at Dufresne where everyone can search Power BI embedded, and there's a whole pack there with all the little niggly things that have got people stuck on their clients. Now, of course, there's the meat and the bones of it, so processes. There's so much to this, but I think the 5 key building blocks that I would urge you to ensure that you've taken the time to think about is workspaces, access management, tenant settings, your gateways, and security. Now, some of these things are just things that happen by default. Everyone can comfortably go and set up some workspaces, but have you taken the time to strategically think about what workspaces your data team are working from? I've entered organizations where it's just the one, dev, and that is where we go. And I build a report and it goes off to HR, it goes off to finance. Where are the right workspaces for not only your developers, but for your people? Have you set up workspaces for your finance teams, for your HR teams, and encourage them to use them? Because giving people access to the data is one thing, but making sure they've got a place to actually put it and serve from it, that is another. Access management. There are probably, 5 ways that you can do access. We can have workspace roles, app audiences, direct report access. We can even just set up links. We could embed in the web. Have a think about each of those different tiers of access and what's going to be right for your organization and for the audience. Tenant settings. Now, I'm sure there's plenty of blogs out there that will tell you about the most critical tenant settings. So I think it takes a bit of time to really get on top of this, but you'd be surprised at the amount of organizations that I enter where no one's even bothered to look at them. Publish to web enabled by default, meaning that if I, go to a Power BI report and there's no row level security, I can embed that in the web and I could give you my organization's sensitive data right now. I could send it to my mum, I could send it to my neighbor. Nothing stopped me doing that. I know this seems like really silly stuff, but you'd be surprised at the number of people that we encounter that haven't had the time to think about this yet. And it's because it is a bit overwhelming. It's overwhelming to switch on a tenant and all of a sudden you've got all this to worry about. And I think what it really comes down to is Power BI is a fantastic tool that can be easily adopted with very little cost. And that's fantastic. We love that. But you need to make sure that when you now know as an organization that that's where you want to be working and you're relying on it for your sensitive data, spend the time to get these things right. Gateways, security, just making sure that you've got a defined strategy for these things and taking the time to consider them. Now, I also attended a talk yesterday by Hilk Peak. He had a great session on fabric governance, and he really talked about some of the more practical stuff. How do you actually go about setting up sensitivity labels, endorsement? So at the point at which all the kind of recordings come out, make sure to catch that one if you want any more info on some of the kind of meat and the bones of that. Now, lastly, technology. So having the right people in place and the processes is well and good, but what technology are you augmenting your organization with to let them do their job? Development standards. Taking the time to define, we shift it left, we don't do lots of Power Query, all of these things, how to model, when to model. We often at organizations roll out a modeling flowchart. We encourage people to define when to model. Now, deployment pipelines, again, I could have spent 50 minutes just talking to you about deployment pipelines. It's a part of Power BI that has really came on leaps and bounds in the last year alone, given the launch of Git integration. So make sure to take the time to think about that. If you don't have Power BI Premium, you know what? SharePoint version control is fine, but make sure that you're taking the time to intentionally set up how your people are going to work with that. And lastly, monitoring. Now, there's been some fantastic suppliers of monitoring solutions at SQL Bits this week. So Power BI Sentinel, Measure Killer. I think we've actually got Greg in the room. Yeah, we do. There we go. So all of these tools are fantastic ways for you to monitor what's happening in your Power BI organization. You can, of course, do custom monitoring. So again, at Hilk's talk yesterday, he talked about how you use REST APIs and build a custom monitoring solution. There are so many ways to do it. It's just about taking the time to think about it. And that's what I hope that you get from this session today, is just starting to provoke that thought. Now, lastly, I'm just going to talk about, there's the textbook. Of course, there's the right way to do things. But there's always going to be, no matter how long you've been in the game and how big the organization is, there'll always be something that trips you up where you're stuck at a point of, right, I shouldn't really do this, but it's what people need. I would advise that you should define a set of key principles. And when you make your decisions, it's okay to deter from the textbook as long as you meet these key principles. Now, for me, it's these 4. First of all, is your data secure? At the end of the day, if the thing that you're doing is going to keep your data secure and it's not diverging from your security strategy, well, why not? Does it maintain one version of the truth? If the version of the action you're taking is going to maintain that version of the truth, so if that's these users over here, they really need to see that KPI in a slightly different way, well, does that mean now you need a new data set just to serve them? Well, how does that compromise your version of the truth? If you can consider how to give those multiple KPIs, perhaps with different naming conventions, nobody wants to see revenue twice in 2 different reports called the same thing. If it's actually revenue and revenue by X, have it in the same data set, call it those 2 things. And that's the way that you can make these decisions, by keeping these principles intact. Reduce the overhead. Nobody wants to create solutions that leave their BI teams overwhelmed. You should not need a massive team of people just keeping the lights on from Power BI. You want to have those people enabled and empowered to innovate and continue to produce reporting, be out there with the business and understand, what do you need, what are you missing, and what can I get to you? The more that people are unpicking what they've got and unpicking that tech debt, the less they're innovating. And last but not least, and probably the most important, keep people happy. At the end of the day, as Power BI developers, I think it's very easy for us all to get in a box and think this is the right way to do it and I'm not doing that. But if people aren't happy, if your users aren't engaged, why are we all here? And so I need to remind myself of this quite a lot when I think, right, I shouldn't really help this person that's wrangling a spreadsheet with Power Query, but if I'm months away from getting their data in a data platform and helping them strategically, why can't I help them set up a strategic Power Query transformation that's going to get them their data a lot quicker than they are just now? And this really, to me, is what it comes down to. Take the time to define what you want Power BI to be for your business and how you want to roll that out. Defining a set of key principles, think about that shopping list of the people, the process, and the technology, and then you'll be very much on your way. Now, thank you so much for spending your 20 minutes talking about Power BI culture with me. You can leave your feedback here, as I'm sure you've all been doing all your other sessions. Every feedback session, money is donated by SQL Bits to an organisation of your choice in that form. I think we've got like 1 minute for any questions, if we have any. Yeah, lovely. The sheet, I think we're happy to share slides, if that's possible through SQL Bits. Yeah.
Yeah, if you upload to Sessionize,
yes.
Upload those to Sessionize, they get mailed out.
Good stuff. Yep, they'll be available. But hopefully this then you can take away and start to map out your own Power BI culture strategies. Any more? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, as a consultant, do you usually get admin access? Preferably, yeah. So most organizations I go into, if I'm saying I need to fix your tenant settings, then yeah, I need admin access. There's ways around this, spreadsheets that have got all the tenant settings in it and you give them to the client, but much more productive if you can make sure you got the access. So I'm afraid that's time. But yeah, thank you so much. I think I'll be around just for a wee bit more if anyone wants to come up and say hello or ask any questions. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone.